Glenn Greenwald. Hello.
Hey, Matt. How you doing?
I am doing well. This has been certainly a busy week on our overlapping beats here for Reason Magazine, Libertarian Magazine, Free Minds, Free Markets, etc., and Glenn Greenwald, master of all things civil liberties at Salon. Is there a better way to describe you?
No, that was such a smooth introduction as well. You sort of melded the introductory aspects into the narrative. That was quite well done.
Thank you very much. We are here on day like 3 or 4 of the latest big WikiLeaks trench of diplomatic cables and the kind of controversies that ensue. I'm particularly interested in some of the stuff that you've been writing about this, kind of examining what you think that says in reaction to it, kind of in a meta sense, says about modern American political discourse, media, and so on. What do you see this revealing about ourselves as we react to the mass dumping of hundreds of thousands or millions of documents?
It's interesting. I think that this is one of those issues where people are reacting and forming their opinions based on their views on issues that aren't always, and in fact usually aren't, specifically and expressly stated. So I think what has happened is this WikiLeaks debate has sort of become a proxy for people's views on other issues that are kind of lurking there. The first of which I'd say that kind of is predominant is what one's views are on the extent of secrecy in the U.S. government and the extent to which it's really become excessive. You know, I think everybody probably agrees that the U.S. government classifies more than it should. I mean, obviously there are all kinds of innocuous things that end up being leaked as part of these document dumps that everybody would agree are inconsequential and shouldn't be classified. So I think everybody would agree that there's some excess classification going on. The question is the extent to which you actually perceive that as a danger. So if you're somebody who says, yeah, I think there's some things that probably shouldn't be secretive, they probably, classify things a bit too reflexively and baselessly, but I don't really consider that to be such an enormous problem that can be just fixed with some added oversight, some additional layers of scrutiny. Then you're probably somebody who thinks that what WikiLeaks is doing with this full-on blunderbuss disclosure is both unnecessary and damaging because it's not really addressing a problem that you think is particularly severe. But if you're somebody who actually thinks that the U.S. government is operating behind this incredibly opaque and virtually impenetrable wall of secrecy, whereby most of what the government does that's of any significance are things that take place beyond the knowledge or understanding of the citizenry, and that this wall of secrecy enables all kinds of abuse and lawlessness and rampant corruption and the like, then I think you're a lot more inclined to think that WikiLeaks, even if you think there's some excessive disclosure or some things they're doing that are too indiscriminate, you're inclined to be much more receptive to what it is that they're doing, which is subverting this regime of secrecy. And I definitely fall into the latter camp that I just described. I'm sure there's lots of variations in between. And that's why I think what WikiLeaks is doing, notwithstanding some legitimate concerns and the like, on balance is extraordinarily good and even, I'd go so far as to say heroic.
I think it's a pretty interesting kind of grouping of reactions there, and I might add a third, which maybe overlaps at both categories. People who are susceptible to extremely binary concepts, especially when it comes to national security. People who will say with a straight face, talk about trade-offs between liberty and security as if it's a single scale, and if you lift the brick off this scale, the other one goes down or up. I'm confused with my own metaphor now, but you get what I'm talking about. People who, I was just thinking, walking to work today in preparation for this discussion, it's always a good exercise to go back and see what it was that you were arguing with various people about, like in 2005, because it's, in many cases, people have switched teams because their team is in or out of power, or people were there all along very susceptible to these binary trade-offs between liberty and security. And I was recalling a story that's been since mostly forgotten. I think the LA Times broke it about how, some PR company based in Washington was handing bags of cash to various Iraqi media outlets and newspapers in order to sort of create favorable coverage and even plant stories. And the reaction to that piece of journalism by a lot of people on the right, including people who today are using words like treason and espionage and whacking Julian Assange in the colorful phrase of Bill Kristol, we're saying back then that the LA Times should be, rung up on treason for pointing out that we were engaged in kind of petty and in my estimation, self-defeating media corruption in Iraq. And I think you have people who simply look at this and say, does this harm our ability to do X? And X is usually some variation on the status quo or on prosecuting the war on terror or, the David Brooksian kind of look. This is hurting our chance to be, of American exceptionalism. Then, therefore, we must make it stop.
Right.
And it's a useful reminder, especially from people in my camp, of libertarians who believe very strongly in civil liberties in a shrill manner, and who also are economic libertarians, or more friendly with fiscal conservatives than, for instance, you might be. For the last couple of years, the conversation has been mostly about fiscal conservatism. These issues have only come up sporadically, and it's always a very useful reminder that the streak of national security-flavored authoritarianism is alive and well within a broad swath of kind of GOP or GOP-friendly audience out there, and it just reminds me that these tendencies are illiberal in the classical term of the phrase, and somewhere on the scale between dangerous and comical.
Well, it's interesting. There was a post today by Kevin Drum that I saw where he was essentially expressing this kind of exasperation that our economy is collapsing, that we're about to enter this decade-long period of Japan-style stagnation. Nobody seems very interested in doing much about that. The government's not taking the steps that he thinks ought to be taken, or really taking any steps to address that problem, and instead we're sort of caught up in these, what he considers to be just kind of melodramatic sideshows, one of which is, the latest Sarah Palin outburst, and one of which is WikiLeaks. And, the reason why I kind of take exception to that is because the concept of secrecy versus transparency that isn't really confined to a civil liberties issue or, sort of this boutique area of concern. I mean, it basically pervades every single aspect of what government does. And what's interesting is, just following along the lines of what you just said about these kind of shifting perspectives based upon which policy is being promoted or undermined.
You dropped off, Glenn.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. So what's interesting about that is about a year ago, there was a really oft-discussed leak of all of the emails from climatologists that many people on the right celebrated as evidence that climate change theories were actually fictitious, that scientists were deliberately concealing incriminating evidence that undermined the prevailing orthodoxies and the like. Those emails were leaked by hackers, and then lots of them were leaked by WikiLeaks. And Sarah Palin, who this week called for WikiLeaks and Julian Assange to essentially be just murdered, indiscriminately treated like Al-Qaeda and the Taliban with no due process, last year in the Washington Post wrote an op-ed heralding the importance of these emails and the light that they shine on these important factions within the climatology community. And so there definitely is lots of shifting views on it, but whatever else is true, I mean, if your concern is economics and financial policy or domestic issues, so much of what takes place in that realm as well involves things like lobbyists meeting in secret with the White House and with White House officials. And lots of transparency groups have been devoted to things like extracting lists of people who are visiting the White House, or communications that they have with lobbyists or people in business or people in their electoral base. And so it doesn't really matter what area of political concern you focus on most. If, no matter what it is, transparency promotes better policy, less corruption, and greater accountability, and most of all, better democracy, since we'll know more about what our government is doing. And that, to me, is like, you asked me, what does this sort of say about our political and media class? I mean, to me, the most shocking and kind of amazing thing has been this. Like, I totally understand why people in government want to protect their secrets. I mean, everybody wants to protect their secrets. That's just a natural human behavior. People in government, you could argue, part of their charge, their duty, is to safeguard what they consider to be legitimate secrets. So I understand why they're angry. Their private communications are being disclosed. When they wrote them, they didn't think they would be. But so I don't really. That doesn't surprise me. And it doesn't surprise me that there's lots of citizens who are angry and who are essentially saying, I want the government to keep these things from me. I'm angry that I've learned about them. I wish that these things remain concealed from me. But what amazes me the most is that people who call themselves journalists, who at some point in their life made a choice to go into the world of journalism and presumably were devoted to values of exposure and transparency and accountability and being adversarial checks on people in power, they seem to me to be the angriest, like leading the lynch mob in the 2-minute hate sessions against Julian Assange. Like, they seem to be the people who believe in have the least amount of belief in the values of transparency and are the angriest of all that the government's behavior has been exposed in so many ways by WikiLeaks. And that's what I think is most warped and most disturbing, is that the mindset of so many of our journalists is very much to protect and defend and be devoted to people in power rather than what they claim to be, which are people who are supposed to be adverse and attempting to constantly shine lights on what it is that they're doing. And you see that as starkly this week as I think you have in a long time. Yeah,
I used to work at the LA Times on their editorial page department for a couple of years, and had some insight there. I mean, I had a good experience, and I treasure my colleagues, each and every one of them, former colleagues. But that, and then covering the media and noticing things over the years and tracking, especially the output of the much, maligned, unsigned editorial in newspapers, which for some reason I used to edit and write myself. That is like the conduit for which you get this type of thinking, more concentrated probably than anywhere else. And looking at their reaction to this to some degree, and then also to other recent issues like the TSA kind of a revolt, or a minimalist revolt or scandal about enhanced interrogation or pat-downs and such. And also specifically in California, I was tracking what the editorial departments were saying about Proposition 19, which would seem to be unrelated, but it also involves kind of a sense of what is the deeply held status quo. And this has led me to a conclusion that there's this element in journalism, and you see it in your Wolf Blitzers, and you see it in your Joe Kleins, who you singled out the other day. Joe Klein, who, by the way, I think almost a half a dozen times in the last year has suggested that people be, various Republican-noid commentators or politicians be rung up for sedition, which is a very charming thing for a journalist to suggest.
Right, for excess criticism of the president, for that crime.
Right. These people see themselves as serious with a capital S, and so they and most of the critics when they are attacking either those newspapers or attacking these entrenched policies, even if they're policies that the newspapers themselves claim to say that they abhor. Like, the San Francisco Chronicle says that the drug war is a laughable joke, blah, 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 but we can't legalize pot just yet because it would cause confusion or something. It is incredible how much people get wedded to the status quo, particularly when they consider themselves sort of non-ideological. There is an unspoken ideology of we are part of a power structure. We are entrusted with this very awesome responsibility to comment on it and process it and interrogate the people who are also part of it. And what ends up happening, more than anything else, and more than any kind of like traceable ideology, in my opinion, is that you adhere to and find reasons to sort of defend that status quo from any unseemly kind of uprising against it. The Assange thing, I mean, he himself is a character. He looks like, a bad villain out of some Bruce Willis movie from 1988 or something, right? He's kind of comically dislikable on a visceral sense. He's sort of a weird wisp of hair and triangular face.
He's a loser that's easy to kind of laugh at and look down upon and scorn if you're sort of...
Or like a winner that you could dislike for other reasons.
From the perspective of people who kind of value their position in orthodoxy and in prevailing institutions, who whose status is accounted for by their ability to blend in, that kind of a person is just universally scorned in Washington. And so if you want to not be seen as being odd or weird or marginalizing yourself, then you too need to take that view of him.
Yeah, and I mean, it was revealing to me in looking at the pot stuff, and again, we're talking about 26 of the top 30 dailies in California editorialized against Prop 19.
Right.
26 out of 30. And I mean, it's just stunning. And the language that they used, and the language that Arnold Schwarzenegger used, were things like, if we do this, then California will be the laughing stock. It was less, that this would lead to, or I mean, it was in addition to this would lead to bad policies or whatever, but like this would be seen as unserious, and we can't have that as guardians of the serious.
Right.
And I think Assange is a threat to the guardian of the serious. And from my point of view, I'm almost certain that the indiscriminate nature of the releases will probably make life harder for very good people who dare to speak up against their authoritarian regimes in various hellholes around the world. And I lament any of that, as that happens. And I'm sure he has and will continue to create errors along the way. That is my standard disclosure, and we've gotten that out of the way. Having said all that, because it doesn't come scrubbed in this kind of language and culture that is acceptable, this narrow language and culture that's acceptable to this kind of professionalized, serious person mindset, it is going to be attacked, and it is going to be that is going to be a huge part of the story going forward. And it's to me, it's very revealing. It's astonishing how narrow it is, the band of acceptable modes of discourse or journalism is in official circles. And it's something that, as someone who lives on ideological margins or professional margins on various types, and I'm going to go ahead and rope you in on that as well. I think we tend to be more sensitive to noticing that on a day-to-day basis than your standard issue Democrat or standard issue Republican.
Well, I'll give you
I'll
give you an interesting example that highlights that very dynamic that you just described, which is when Sarah Palin was first sort of thrust onto the national scene, and she was interviewed by Charlie Gibson, which was sort of the first episode where the nation kind of all got together and agreed collectively to mock her. One of the answers that she gave that prompted a lot of derision was when he asked her whether she supported having Georgia join NATO, as well as some other former Soviet republics. And she said that she did, and then he then said, so does that mean that you actually think we should go to war with Russia if Russia wages war again on Georgia or any of the other states? And she said, yes, I think we should go to war with Russia over Georgia and these other states as well. And everybody thought this was, just such extraordinary evidence of this kind of like unserious extremism that showed what a warmonger she is and how crazy she was. The reality was, though, that the official Washington position in both parties, Joe Biden had said it months earlier, Obama ended up saying it as well, was that essentially we should be receptive to the idea that Georgia and these other breakaway former Soviet republics could join NATO. And the effect necessarily of having them join NATO is that we then become treaty bound to defend them or go to war against any country, including Russia, that attacks them. But what made, so she was doing nothing other than expressing the most conventional bipartisan foreign policy consensus. But what made it the subject of so much scorn was that she didn't phrase it in this kind of acceptable Washington jargon way. She was unserious in her expression of it because she was too blunt about it. She was too sort of unsophisticated in how she expressed it. And that's what the media does, is they enforce these rigid Washington orthodoxies, which very much is, as you suggested, an ideology, notwithstanding their endless protestations that they're the beacons of neutrality. And I think it's interesting when I first started writing about politics. I mean, it was obvious to me that notwithstanding the very pervasive and widely believed cliche of the liberal media, it was obvious, and I think lots of people acknowledge it now, that during the Bush years, especially after September 11th, the media was extraordinarily deferential to the Bush administration, the liberal media. I mean, it was the New York Times leading the way on its front page and pumping the nation full of all kinds of false claims to justify the war, and the Washington Post editorial page was the most vocal pro-war. Oregon, anywhere in the country, the side of Weekly Standard. You even had Scott McClellan, the former Bush press secretary, writing a book criticizing and mocking the press for being too deferential to the claims of the Bush administration, something completely inconsistent, all of that, with the idea that there's some kind of leftist media. And there was a debate at the time on the left among a lot of people about what the real bias of the media was. And a lot of people pointed to the deference that they paid to the Bush administration and to these policies as proof that they weren't a liberal media, they were actually a conservative media or a pro-Republican media. And a lot of people pointed to the fact that it was the media driving the Clinton scandals in the late 1990s, even though Americans in large numbers, large majorities, didn't care about those sex scandals. It was the media pushing it. And I had originally thought that was the case too, and the more I sort of looked at things and thought about it, the more I came to believe that what the real bias of the media is not pro-Republican or pro-Democrat or liberal or conservative. The real bias is they revere those in power. They essentially serve whoever is prevailing in terms of our political struggles and who has the most, the best position. Jay Rosen, the journalism professor at NYU, calls it the church of the savvy, meaning like they worship and revere whoever it is who's successful at accumulating power. And there's lots of reasons for that. It's cultural, it's pragmatic, and the people who are in power are in a position to do favors for journalists, so those tend to be the people they serve. By identifying with people who are successful and powerful, you become part of the in-group as well. I mean, it's just a basic sociological or psychological dynamic. But I agree entirely that that is the core cultural disposition of the American media, is to be subservient to the state, the government, the people in power. And that's actually the very opposite of what the media is supposed to be, which is outside of power, a check on it, an adversary to it.
Yeah, Bradley Bacco has been, on our side, has been putting forth the argument that basically the media isn't liberal, it's statist, which is a way of saying the same thing. I mean, there is I think, a deference to power, maybe from the point of view of the people who engage in it, less abjectly deferential, but more like, we're all part of the same team. I mean, you get that with Joe Klein, who's, I think, really interesting and in many ways loathsome character. He really defines himself, and I think he's had some scraps with you over the years, defines himself for how patriotically he takes seriously Americans' foreign policy in Southeast Asia, and because he thinks about it so wonderfully. And I saw he moderated a panel at the Democratic Convention in 2008 that I attended, and this is right in the middle of the Georgia crisis. And whoever introduced him at this panel, Madeleine Albright's group, if I'm not mistaken, introduced him like that. Like, there are few Americans who care and know as much about our sacred duties in Southeast Asia or Central Asia as Joe Klein, and he wears that like a badge, as if his interest is just more patriotic than your interest or whoever his critics' interests are, which is a really odd, I think, affectation and defense mechanism, particularly from people who, by definition, are more influential or have more power than the likes of the rabble-rousers who are sort of throwing rocks at their heels. Speaking of the sort of deferential thing, I looked at various TSA-related editorials 5 or 6 days ago, and it was stunning. I mean, I understand the argument. I might disagree with it, but I understand the argument saying, "Hey, look, there needs to be a trade-off, blah blah blah," the usual liberty security stuff, which I disagree with on a lot of levels. We can get into, but whatever. It's an intellectual argument for whatever it is. But they didn't stop there in their editorials. They said basically, I mean literally, in some cases, shut up and
I think "grow up" was the phrase, the favored phrase. Grow up.
Yeah, Jay Rosen assigned a thing about grow up. I mean, it was just, a bend over, I think, was actually used on some level, like mocking people for feeling that their dignity was being violated gratuitously and ineffectively and in the service of this kind of security theater, us adult people are telling you that you are being silly because you don't understand the way we understand this terrible terror, and that's going to nip at our heels at any given moment. And it's incredibly arrogant and condescending point of view.
This is what I mean. It's like, that is what you see over and over and over again, no matter what the political issue is, no matter which side of the ideological spectrum it is. You see this complete disdain for the idea that any members of the citizenry can or should have a say in the political process except by going and politely voting. They despise protest or street marches or any effort to express dissatisfaction with the Washington culture. And there's so many reasons for that. But I think the two big ones is there's been a big sociological shift in how in who journalists are, just socioeconomically. I mean, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, this sort of iconic journalist, and there were some exceptions, but they were kind of like lower middle class, had a working class mentality. They were very much removed from the halls of power. I don't want to idealize it. I mean, like I said, there's lots of exceptions, but that really was the kind of working model of what, newspaper people were and journalists. Now what you have are basically, mostly multimillionaires who work for large corporations who have, the same kind of sort of pseudo-Washington celebrity status as the politicians, the most powerful politicians in Washington. They're the ones with whom they interact most. They form, this sort of very insular culture in Washington, people who have, who occupy the most influential positions in both the political and media class. And so they identify with one another instead of viewing each other as adversaries. And so they identify with that culture and they each seek to protect it. I mean, it was so funny. I did this, some MSNBC show earlier today about WikiLeaks, and I was on with Jonathan Capert, who calls himself a journalist. He writes for the Washington Post editorial page. And then Susan Molinari, the former Republican congresswoman from Staten Island. And we were talking about WikiLeaks, and of course they both agreed that WikiLeaks was the root of all evil and the spawn of Satan and was endangering us all. And I was taking the opposite position. And what struck me so much is that their viewpoints were so completely interchangeable and identical. I mean, they were both giggling with one another over what a loser Julian Assange was, how funny it was that he was in an undisclosed location, how irresponsible and reckless it was that he actually shone some light on what the U.S. government was doing, something the Washington Post editorial page, for which Jonathan Capert works, is supposed to do but doesn't. And it's because a Republican congresswoman and a quote-unquote journalist who works at the Washington Post editorial page are different in name only, but they're essentially part of the same culture. And then the other aspect of it is that, most of our largest media outlets have become really corporatized. You don't just go and work for a newspaper any longer, and certainly don't go and work for, a television news outlet. You basically become a corporate employee. And people in general who thrive in corporations and who succeed in corporations are people who are really good at and inclined to figure out how to accommodate what their bosses want, what authority wants, what the people and the structure that they're working demand of them, and how to stay in their good graces. And that's the mentality that these media corporations breed and reward. And that, to me, seems to be the exact antithesis of what journalists constitutionally ought to be inclined to do, which is to challenge power, disrupt it, subvert it, essentially, as the old cliche goes, afflict the powerful and comfort the powerless. They do exactly the opposite. They're there to comfort the powerful, and that's why our media is such a profound failure, and it's why they hate WikiLeaks, because WikiLeaks is actually doing that. WikiLeaks is actually adversarial, bringing about accountability and shining a light on what political factions are doing without any regard for what those political factions think of them. And I think a big part of the media hostility is that they're just being shown up by contrast.
I think there's something to your socioeconomic analysis, which is something that I've noticed for a long time myself, being not a monocle-wearing billionaire. I come from a perfectly acceptable background, but I'm a college dropout, and when I started working for newspapers, I went looking for the smoking and cussing guys and gals and people who saw this kind of zeal in what they did of holding all institutions particularly government above all, accountable and under fire in a tough but fair way. And it was just continually shocked by how that wasn't so. And part of it is that, I mean, take a strata down from your sort of multimillionaire media celebrity thing, but most likely you will have gone to school or will have interacted with people who become, let's say, diplomats. I have plenty of friends who I have worked with in the past who've joined the Foreign Service. And if you have an interest in, let's say, Central Europe in the 1990s, which I do, you are going to gravitate towards people who have the same interest, and those people are going to be academics and diplomats and a few other people, and maybe people in the countries themselves who are active in some way or shape or another. But that is your natural group to talk to and talk with, and it's pretty different than your average person who might be living in an area that is affected or served by that media. And that trend and that professionalization, the emphasis on postgraduate degrees and all this kind of stuff has led to that. I think you have less kind of lifestyle diversity. There's certainly more diversity of women. That's been probably the best single thing about media besides technological advancements. But major media used to be a really nasty old boys club until pretty damned recently, and you still see a lot of that in various places. Opinion journalism, by definition, is a male enterprise, both in terms of readers and in terms of writers, unfortunately. But at newspapers and things like that, it's gotten a lot more female. I think that's improved things a great deal. But in terms of lifestyle, where the hell did you come from? What do you think? And definitely ideological diversity, which is really sorely lacking. I can testify from being on the inside a little bit sometimes. It's just not there. There's an incredible amount of sameness of the way people think at large institutions, which should be alarming. It's one of the reasons why I've always advocated, and I tried really hard and failed at the LA Times to push through it in the editorial department, of like disclosing the living hell out of everything. Like, all right, here's our editorial board. Let's list everyone's political affiliations and who they voted for in presidential elections the last 30 years. Not that tells you everything, because it doesn't. I mean, if you looked at me, you would just say, oh, he's an insane person. We should
he just randomly chooses.
I wrote in Jerry Brown in 1992, and I edited a libertarian publication. So I should probably just be shot for that. But because you should have confidence and openness, and this kind of gets back to Assange in general. I think that there is a stunning lack of confidence among critics of him and critics in general whenever there is a sort of transparency or disclosure moment in a national security issue. It's our openness, in my opinion, that really helps make us strong. I mean, one of the striking things about these leaks, and I haven't gone into them very deeply at all, I just read the headlines, but there haven't been a whole lot of, oh my God, we were doing this when we said we were doing that. They have roughly been kind of what you would expect American diplomats to do for good and for ill. There hasn't been that much of a gap, at least from what I've said, and I'm sure you'll correct me up, between our stated goals and what we're doing out there. Part of that is because we are, warts and all, a fairly responsive democracy out there. And it's precisely the countries that are the biggest two-faced and oppressive regimes, like in Saudi Arabia and other places. They're the ones who suddenly look like they're completely, triple talking their own citizens a lot more than us. And I think, this whole thing has been an advertisement for openness, even though it's a forced openness by a foreigner who we're trying to assassinate and all that kind of stuff. And actually, I want to segue from that quickly to, since you're following this closer than I am, what is your take on what Eric Holder is doing and what the official kind of government response to this, an Obama administration response to this?
Right, so let me just address that one other point, though, that you just raised, which is the idea that there's not much there that is particularly incriminating in terms of exposing duplicity and the like.
Not incriminating, I would say, like, surprising more than
exactly.
Than
I mean, just a couple things about that. I don't entirely disagree with that, actually. In fact, I probably agree with that more than I disagree with it. But just a couple of caveats. I mean, number one is, like, the stuff that WikiLeaks has been disclosing is fairly low-level information on the rung of secrecy, on the rung of the secrecy ladder. I mean, this is basically even in the terms of the Iraq and Afghanistan releases, which I think were more interesting and more surprising and more incriminating, they were basically just field reports. I mean, I don't think there's been a single document in any of these releases that have been classified as top secret. In fact, I'm certain that that's true. And there's even, layers beyond top secret where, a very small number of people are privy to the kinds of things that exist on that level. So, if there's something that were truly shocking, it's extremely unlikely that it would be recorded, that it would be among the stuff that WikiLeaks has gotten its hands on, at least thus far. And then the other aspect is, surprise and shock and all that is kind of a function of expectations. Personally, when I watched the video of the Apache helicopter attack in Baghdad, where they shot, multiple clear civilians, even as they were laying on the ground wounded and then scampering for safety, and then shot up, a truck filled with their children. That was pretty shocking to me. Not even though rationally, I know that takes place every day. Seeing it viscerally, I think, can open up a lot of people's eyes. There's been other stuff like the deliberately blind eye that we've turned to the systematic human rights abuses and torture that took place right under our noses by our, Iraqi client state. And the like. So, and I mean, some people might think that Hillary Clinton's demands for email passwords and biometric information on UN officials and other officials is somewhat surprising, although, I guess not. So, I think it's probably true that things haven't been all that surprising, but that's because I think there's an expectation that the U.S. government lies and does bad things in the world. I mean, that was certainly the lesson of the Iraq War. I mean, we may not do it to the extent that, say, duplicity, to the extent that, autocratic dictatorships do, although I think the damage that we do is much greater. But just one point about the issue about openness and the like. There's some people who think that WikiLeaks is going to essentially have a counterproductive effect on transparency, because by essentially acquiring all these documents and then just dumping them, it's going to make the government clamp down internally on its own deliberation process, on its own disclosure process. They're going to be much more careful about who can access what. And that the effect will actually be the opposite of transparency, that it'll actually make the government constrict even further and hide even further behind walls of secrecy. And what's interesting is there's an interview that Julian gave from about a month ago, I think, that's just gotten some attention in the last few days, in which
Forbes?
What's that?
The Forbes interview?
No, it's an interview in this sort of small journal. Okay. And I don't know, I'll send the blog hits people the link, and I encourage people to read it. It's really fascinating. But one of the things he says is that he anticipates that one of the effects of his leak will be to cause the government and the Pentagon and the whole national security state to constrict further in terms of the disclosures and the secret and transparency that it allows, but that he considers that to be a good thing, because the less transparency institutions have, the less openness they have, the more secrecy they hide behind, the less effective they become, the more inept they become, the more paralyzed. And essentially his strategy for, it's sort of like Osama bin Laden's strategy in 9/11 was to provoke the United States into doing suicidal, bankrupting things like invading and attacking the Muslim world for decades, to exactly what we did. Julian's theory of how these kind of disclosures will end up subverting American imperial power, as he sees it, is that it will do exactly that. It'll drive the government and the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex into further degrees of secrecy, which will essentially paralyze it and make it less effective and more corrupt, and that'll cause it further to collapse in on itself, precisely because openness is such an important attribute of effective large organizations.
That's fascinating. We can't know the effects of this, I think, but being an eternal optimist in California and psychotic, I tend to think that this will probably trigger greater declassification. It might indeed make people less willing to put things down on paper or virtual paper or whatever. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe people look at this and say, you know what? These cables from this meeting, they're kind of well written and funny, and it's not really a big deal. And if people are going to know about them, who cares? But I think in general, there has been almost a kind of across the spectrum reaction to this, like, well, yeah, of course we're overclassifying right now. So maybe that will lead to less banal secrecy. Maybe there's more like hardcore secrecy at the center of all of it, because certainly there's going to be a lot of plumbers out there trying to look for where these leaks are coming from, and they're going to be more serious about that maybe than they were 2 months ago. But maybe it leads to some kind of broader openness.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I've been a little bit mystified by the past week or so, and I know I shouldn't be mystified by it. Maybe that's an overstatement, but I mean, it seems important to me, which is that there seems to be among people who want to dismiss the importance of these disclosures, and there's always this inconsistent reaction among WikiLeaks critics. First, we hear there's nothing important, there's nothing significant here, it's all stuff that we already knew, and then in the next breath it's WikiLeaks has endangered the entire world and needs to be snuffed out because of their recklessness. And those two things seem to me to be extremely, to be in extreme tension with one another. But what does seem to me, to be remarkable is that it is true that the vast bulk of these documents are essentially meaningless. I mean, they're extremely innocuous, very routine, don't contain anything remotely interesting. I mean, if you sit there and go click through the documents just in the database of what's been disclosed, not just in this release, but the Iraq and Afghanistan ones too, maybe 1 out of every 50 documents is interesting. The other 49 of the 50 you just kind of click through because they're completely irrelevant. And yet every single one of these documents, virtually, there's some that's not true for, but just about every one has been deemed secret by the government, has been actively concealed from the citizenry, notwithstanding the complete lack of any justifiability or basis for declaring them secret. And that, to me, even if you think that there's nothing scandalous or incriminating in the documents themselves, and I think there is, but even if you think there isn't, that to me seems like it should be scandalous. I mean, presumptively, everything that the government does ought to be open. That's the basis of our whole republic, that we have an open government. That's what allows for consent of the governed. The people with political power that we vest with political power have to do things out in the open. Obviously, there are some exceptions where they're permitted to do things in secret and conceal it, but only with compelling justifications. And yet, that's the power that is being completely abused. I mean, virtually everything they do is routinely concealed from the citizenry by abusively declaring it to be secret, reflexively, instinctively. That's what they do. They do everything behind a wall of secrecy, and that to me seems truly scandalous, like a genuine threat to open government and informed citizenry. And that, I mean, I know that sounds like abstract and kind of like 7th grade civics, but it's actually true.
I couldn't agree more. There's the same people, many of the same people who would be very quick to rightly, criticize communist governments and economies and things like that. What is at core a critique of why planned economies fail? It's because the right information and the right sort of incentives don't get through. The information gets blocked. All decisions are made kind of politically, and the markets, when they flow well and do well, is about as transparent as possible in exchange of information, and the best information in a market is a price and that kind of thing, right? I mean, that's essential theory of how markets work, and the same kind of people who claim to know that and live that and love that way too often, from my point of view, become wedded to just the most banal types of secrecy and overclassification without looking at, how are we hurting ourselves? What kind of information are we stovepiping here, cherry picking there, and just sort of snuffing out? We're not allowing the best people or smartest people to see what's going on, and the best way to do that is to let outsiders look at your junk, not just people who are inside your little silo. I want to transition here because we're at 43 minutes. So you frankly slandered Mark Ames and Yasha Levine.
I did. I hope I'm not going to be sued for that, for slandering them. Do you want to tell that story?
Yeah, briefly. Mark Ames, who, along with Matt Taibbi, was a manic editor, prankster of a Russian expatriate newspaper called Exiled back in the 90s and early aughts, has been on the Koch Industries beat for a couple of years. Koch Industries is the company that is founded by Charles David Koch, or not founded, but they run it, who are huge funders of libertarian institutions. They have donated to the Reason Foundation, which publishes my magazine over the years. They helped found the Cato Institute and the Institute for Humane Studies and other kinds of stuff. They've also gotten involved in more Republicanoid giving here and there, and they're also big philanthropists, and they have a big complicated theory that's similar to what I was just talking about, actually, about market-based management, how to let free market ideas percolate within your own company and this kind of thing. And it has to do with the free flow of information. Anyways, they have become a big bête noire on the left after a New Yorker piece by
George
Jane Meyer
Soros
in
of the
August.
left, basically.
George Soros, right. That's the backdrop. Anyway, so when about a week ago, maybe a little bit more, Ames and his writing partner, who I don't know, Yasha Levine, wrote a piece basically calling into question the backlash against the TSA's new screening and grope-down procedures, suggesting heavily that it was a coordinated, shadowy plant by Koch industry-connected libertarians who are doing it in service of, I'm not really sure what it was, maybe
I think the theory is that the Kochs are behind the TSA protests, A, in order to privatize airport security and make money off that, B, in order to usher in racial profiling by having white Americans object en masse, and then 3 or C, I don't know if I was numbering that order, to hurt Obama. I think that's the tripartite theory of Koch involvement.
Yes. And it was not the best piece of journalism ever written. A couple people from The Nation said publicly that I'm embarrassed by magazine. I know I got emails from within that August progressive institution, as I'm sure you did too. And you wrote a big piece, and probably the most influential or well-linked piece, saying basically shame on them for smearing John Tyner, he was the Don't Touch My Junk guy, in particular, by saying, he grew up near Camp Pendleton. And
he went to Christian
really
school. He went to Christian schools, and he's a libertarian. Therefore, he's not an ordinary guy. What he's presenting himself to be, he's sort of this fake, Koch-controlled and funded plant.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of things wrong with the article you touched on. Just some of them, which is basically focused on the Tyner angle of it. What I found remarkable about the whole thing, beyond just why would you ever either assign or accept a piece about the Kochs or libertarians from a guy who has said previously that if you ever see a libertarian, you should spit in his face. He's called me and other people in the libertarian universe butt maggot and this kind of stuff. He's not exactly your most reliable source on the topic. So I think that's really that's on Katrina Vandenheuvel as much as anybody else. But so this piece went up. It was roundly criticized even within The Nation to some degree, and they let the authors respond to your critique of it, which was a big, anguished, we like Glenn Greenwald, we just don't understand why he's mad at us, but by the way, we lived in Russia and Putin prosecuted us, and he frankly slandered us. It was as bad as their original thing, maybe even worse, depending on how you look at it. And then finally, 5 days later or 4 days later, Vandenheuvel apologized just to the original John Tyner guy. So I've talked too long about it, but
I think there's some interesting things there. I actually viewed Katrina's apology, Vandenheuvel's apology, more favorably than you and other people at Reason did. I thought it was pretty straightforward and unqualified. She went further than those authors did and was at least implicitly critical and pretty expressly critical of what they had done. You can definitely raise some ways to suggest it could have been a little stronger in places, but I thought by and large, given how editors often apologize for things they do that they get wrong, it was a pretty commendable apology. I also would say that I think the issue of Koch funding, where the Koch brothers' money is going, or anybody else's money is going in politics, is a completely legitimate source of inquiry and investigation. I think it's better for that to be disclosed, much better than for it to be concealed. So if it were true that these TSA protests were funded by the Kochs, I don't think it would reflect at all on the question of whether the TSA is doing the right thing, but it would be a worthy topic of journalistic investigation that ought to be scrutinized and investigated. My issue with it, and this is, I think, what's interesting about it is a couple things. I mean, one thing is that when I listen to the John Tyner when I listened to that audio that he posted of him, essentially refusing and resisting the TSA procedures, I actually thought to myself, you can tell by how he's conducting himself that this is just some completely ordinary citizen who is completely unaccustomed to being in these kind of situations. Like, he was very scared and uncertain and shaky. I mean, he was firm about his resolve not to do this, but he was not at all like, throwing caution to the wind. He was unfailingly polite and just very, I thought, kind of nervous and shaky and not very confident, and which is how most people would be in that situation if you're in the airport and that kind of center of attention or being threatened that way. And then, as it turned out, he emailed me, or I had learned that he was a regular reader of mine. And he emailed me or asked somebody through an intermediary if he could talk to me about what he was going through and the like. And I talked to him for about a half an hour a few days before that Nation piece, and he wanted basically to know, he was expressing concerns about the threats the government was making. He wanted to, he was concerned that people were pushing him to sue, and he was worried that, his family and his job were going to be jeopardized by all this attention. I mean, basically extremely, nervous, worried. This deer in the headlights kind of mentality that you would expect from just a completely ordinary person who's not accustomed to being in the middle of political debates, who suddenly is the center of all this negative and positive attention. So when I saw the Nation piece insinuating that he was this like right-wing operative who provoked this and was part of some scheme, I was really surprised, because it was the exact opposite of the impression that was left with me. And so the first thing I started doing when I read that article was I started looking for evidence to see if it were true. And I kept reading, and I kept reading, and it got more and more snide and insulting and smearing and insinuating, but the evidence never came. And the reason I found that, just offensive and notable, offensive because I think, like, if you have a platform, like a journalistic microphone, like Nation Magazine or Reason or Salon or whatever, you have an extra obligation if you're writing about somebody who doesn't have a platform to be extra cautious, especially if you're writing things that reflect negatively on them. If it's just like an ordinary citizen who just, through a combination of luck and circumstances, ended up involved in some political issue, especially somebody who just is asserting their rights against the government, which is a really brave and thing to do, and we need so much more of that. Like, you have an extra obligation, if you're going to write negatively about them, to make sure that what you're writing is fair and accurate, much more so than if someone's doing it about you or me and we can answer and all that. And I thought they completely betrayed that obligation in a way that I thought was just, grotesque. And then the other aspect of it was, I think that one of the reasons why they felt justified in doing it was because they thought that Nation readers would be sympathetic to their hit job by telling them ahead of time, even though we have no evidence, he's a libertarian. And he doesn't believe in voting, and he lives near a Marine base and in a county where there's lots of Republicans. So now that we've completely demonized him, we trust that you'll permit us to do whatever we want to him, no matter how reckless and baseless the things we're saying about him are. And to me, that's just an inherently sort of odious attitude. But in particular, here was somebody who was basically standing up to, like a police state tactics. Whatever you think of the TSA, it's like there's very little citizen resistance to these kind of encroaching civil liberties intrusions. We've had very little of that. And here's somebody who actually did it in a way that, sacrificed and risked a lot of things. And so for them to be, I would expect someone like that to be smeared by Bill Kristol or, National Review or just magazines that take pride in their authoritarianism. But to have it be this crusade led by somebody, writing in a progressive magazine, I just found it particularly disturbing, and why I felt like I had, sort of an extra obligation to write about it.
Yeah, it might surprise you to hear that part of my kind of political journalistic development as a young person in the late 80s was, my first subscription to the Nation magazine. A lot of my root libertarianism come from the likes of Nat Hentoff, people who I was first exposed to there. And there's long been a tradition, and maybe it was a stronger kind of in the New Left era of journalism, of there being just kind of a natural anti-authoritarianism within the kind of progressive New Left tradition of journalism that I've always been attracted to. I mean, it's really what got me into journalism itself. And that you're on the side of the individual in that case, or at least you should be, and it's certainly distressing as someone who's. I had a newspaper in Prague who Katrina Vanden Heuvel's mother, invested in at some point. I come from that universe a lot more than maybe a lot of Reason readers would expect or like to hear about, and that there are really good traditions in that universe, and I think they were just really flouted in an unpleasant and frankly kind of not state loving, but just sort of deferential way, which shocks me, and even in Katrina's apology, she sort of made a poorly worded swipe at Republicans who are now discovering their libertarianism, which is definitely something that people like us have noticed over the last couple of years. But if there was any insinuation that people who take their libertarianism seriously have gone light on the TSA and related issues over the last 10 years. That's
just interesting about that. I don't have much time we have left, but I mean, just on that last point, it's like it is true that there are lots and lots of people on the right who self-identify certainly as conservatives and maybe even libertarians, who claim to be, champions of restrained government and individual liberty and all of that, who absolutely did violate all of those principles by marching lockstep in support of every single expansion of government power and radical executive authority and the like, domestically and internationally, in the name of terrorism.
And economically.
Yeah, right. They really did very little to object, and oftentimes even supported economic policies under Bush that violated their alleged dogma as well. But what is true, and I don't know that a lot of people on the left know this, is that in the early days of the Bush administration, like in the really hardcore, oppressive days of 2002, 2003, there were very few people actually vehemently objecting to what the Bush administration was doing, especially in terms of civil liberties. And some of them were found on the left. I mean, the ACLU and CCR and Russ Feingold, people like that, were definitely, as stalwart as they ended up being in 5 years later, from the first day. But they were joined by, in terms of opposing the Iraq War and opposing the Patriot Act and civil liberties abuses by people, on the right, people at the Cato Institute and Bob Barr and Bruce Fein, the former Reagan Justice Department lawyer. And it is true that there were people that, if you look at those precincts on the right, in terms of their consistency, they were way more vocal in opposing those abuses of the Bush administration, both in civil liberties and in war, than the average Democrat was, or the average, certainly the Democratic Party leadership was. And so whenever, that's why when, I sort of get my hackles up as well, whenever the mere fact that somebody adopts for themselves the label libertarian, they're supposed to be the enemy of the left, because I know in terms of the issues that I work on, there were more allies found in that under that flag than there were in the leadership levels of the Democratic Party. I mean, there weren't many. There was way more hypocrisy and support for it among people on the right and conservatives, but there was a not insubstantial amount as well.
Yeah, and and the reason goes through our whoever's in power, we tend to be kind of critical of them, and so whatever team is allied with those in power, regularly sours on us every 4 years or every 8 years, and it's always kind of humorous to watch. We only have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to get to one thing. I've seen, you are a controversial person within the left. I mean, you get involved in these sort of left-on-left scandals, and usually when I see people, certainly to my left and maybe to yours, who knows, who attack you, sometimes they say, well, why should we listen to this guy who lives in Brazil about foreign policy or national security matters? We shouldn't outsource to this guy. Is he even really patriotic? Tell us in 60 to 90 seconds, where do you live, and how long, and what's your general kind of take on that critique of where you're coming from?
Yeah, actually, that's one of the things. I usually am really able to constrain my anger, but that's one particular criticism that I have a great deal of difficulty with it, because I live in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and the reason is because my partner is Brazilian, and Brazil, like most civilized Western government grants immigration rights to the same-sex foreign spouses of their gay citizens, and as a result, I'm able to have a permanent visa to live with my spouse in Brazil. But the United States explicitly prohibits that by virtue of the Defense of Marriage Act, which the Obama administration is currently defending in court. And as a result, I'm barred from, like thousands and thousands of other gay Americans, from living in the United States with the person with whom I want to spend my life. And so the idea that, I'm still obligated to pay taxes and have the right to vote and every other civic right. So the idea that I'm going to first be, essentially oppressed through discriminatory treatment by the law, and then be told on top of that that I'm somehow barred from participating in civic discourse in the country of which I'm a citizen, and that somehow my opinions ought to be inherently viewed as less credible or important by virtue of that law, really does infuriate me. And, it happens to be the case that we sort of live in a globalized world. I mean, as grotesque as I find Tom Friedman, the world is sort of flat. You don't actually need to be physically in the United States to keep up with and be very aware of, although I am there once every 6 weeks. But I think being in a different country actually gives you an important expanded perspective, and by being removed from the sort of Washington-New York nexus, you're not plugged into that, and you have no allegiance to it. You don't care what it thinks about you, and so I think it fosters some added independence as well.
Well, that's I'm sad to hear that. I've been aware of that abominable issue for a long time. My wife has been involved with some stuff on that, and it's one of those many things. Sadly, too many things that can make you feel pretty ashamed about the policy that our country is able to concoct against people who have natural patriotic sentiment for it, and or a national unpatriotic sentiment, whatever. They're just Americans. They want to live here and like anybody else does. With that, we should go. This has been great. I appreciate talking to you.
I really enjoyed it as well.
Well, we should do it again sometime, and we shall click the stop button for Blogging Heads TV. I'm Matt Welch, editor in Reason, and Glenn Greenwald from Salon, and adieu.
Bye.